Welcome to Women on the Santa Fe Trail. My name is Henrietta Martinez Christmas, and I'm a board member of the Historical Society of New Mexico. I'd first like to shout out to other people that have made lists of women, published about them, and continue to write about women on the Santa Fe Trail. Dr. Fran Levine, Pat Traffis, Joanne Van Coburn, Joy Poole. These are all Santa Fe Trail people. They love the trail. They're what I would call rut nuts. And a good friend of mine, Rose Mestis Thompson, she's actually like a sister to me. We have traveled the trail together, but her family actually worked and benefited from being on the Santa Fe Trail. Another colleague is Doyle Daves, an author who frequently writes for Wagon Tracks and has published quite a bit of information about women and the trail, which is surprising, but he's taken an interest in that. Again, there has been early scholarship work on women on the trail. Some people are surprised by this because it was not a settlement trail, but used mainly for commerce. Again, I have to ask people, is sending your daughter off to school considered a commercial adventure? And in some respects, I would say that it is. The Santa Fe Trail was born out of several previous attempts in exploration, along with expansionism. Pedro Vial, who blazed a trail from San Antonio to Santa Fe and then off to St. Louis, probably would have traversed what we call the Santa Fe Trail many times. Earlier soldiers had traversed the plain into Nebraska in 1720, and even earlier than that in the 1600s. Spanish soldiers had this adventurism built within them to explore and see the vast areas, what we now call the United States. The trail was being worked on at both ends, from the US headed west and the Spanish headed east. Not a surprise for trail scholars to realize that eventually there would be a trail from point A to Santa Fe, or vice versa, which would likely happen in the 1800s. The subsequent change in government that took place in late November 1821, that is when New Mexicans first heard about it, and we call it our Mexican period. In December 1821, a celebration took place for the newly formed government of Mexico. This was long after Becknell left Missouri, and perhaps he even heard about the news when he was in Santa Fe. So let's take a look at some of the women on the trail. Families, or many families in colonial Spanish New Mexico, had long sent their children to school, mostly boys, into Durango or other parts of Mexico. Education was not lost to the New Mexicans. For one, to continue their existing merchant business, they had to be educated and schooled in the ways of commerce. The terminology, locations, or geography would all play into this. Knowing math in terms of cargo, weights, distances, are all something that is learned. Knowing what items are in high demand and finding those resources within New Mexico for obvious trade in Mexico, again, is knowledge that for the most part goes unnoticed when we talk about education. Much of this learning may have happened at home. Nevertheless, they were quite successful with their businesses. Documents we look at, such as estate inventories, also give us a deep understanding of what kind of domestic wares women would have wanted: clothing, jewelry, home items that were used during these times. Women would, and still to this day, dress in the latest fashions, wear jewelry, and host dinner parties. Dinnerware and linens would continue to be much sought after during the Santa Fe Trail. So why look at family groups? They work together, but most importantly is they intermarried. This is why the Rio Bajo, or people south of Santa Fe, had such increased wealth during the days of the Santa Fe Trail. These families would even loan money to the Mexican government. So sending a daughter, let's say, off to boarding school to ensure familiar relations and create new ones should be of no surprise to those that have worked in the colonial and Mexican periods in New Mexico. Instead of sending the kids south, they sent them east. From the period of 1821 to 1829, and I call it working out the kinks of the trail, it became more user-friendly as time went on. The wives, servants of many of these men accompanied them on the trail. Women not only could cook, but they knew how to shoot rifles, drive wagons, and understand the fundamentals of caravans and the goods involved. In November 30, 1829, I can't read the list, it's illegible to me, but there was a group of Spaniards that came into New Mexico from Chihuahua, and there were 6 women. This period, I say, is when they, again, were working out the kinks of the trail. After all, if a woman traveled to St. Louis, they had to have some accommodations on that end. They also had to have a place to stay. And I think at that point, they realized that learning English could actually benefit them. Later on in the northern front, Colorado was opening up. Once Trinidad was founded, entire families traveled that part of the Santa Fe Trail, and many settled in that area, north to Huerfano and into Pueblo or Fort Pueblo, which was founded in the 1840s. The 1830s continued to bring different women onto the Santa Fe Trail. Again, I call it the mestizo or mixed race, French, Spanish, Indian, people who lived in Taos and had already blazed the trail many times into and out of New Mexico. An example is Kit Carson and his Arapaho wife, who had a daughter, Adeline, also known as Prairie Flower. Adeline attended Sacred Heart Academy in St. Louis. She later returned to New Mexico and eventually made her way to California, where she is buried. Although Kit would marry Josefa Jaramillo in 1843, no doubt Josefa traveled the trail. She is thought to have the first pedal sewing machine in New Mexico, and there's much documentation that she traveled the northern branch of the Santa Fe Trail. So again, husbands and wives and children were on the trail fairly early on. But let's take a look at some of the girls that went to school on the east or eastern of New Mexico. Some of these gals went to one of 2 schools. One would have been Georgetown in DC and Sacred Heart in St. Louis. Several New Mexico girls attended Georgetown Academy, which was founded in 1799. Mercedes Chavez, born to Jose Chavez y Castillo and Manuela Armijo from the Albuquerque area, attended along with a couple of her Chavez cohorts. They could have been cousins. As part of the school program, Mercedes learned to play the piano. The same year, Dolores Chavez won an award for geography. Dolores also was awarded for grammar and composition. Now, the economics of these girls wasn't really an issue. They were heiresses in their own right. Their families owned thousands of sheep, thousands of acres of land. They had developed businesses all along the Camino Real, the Spanish Trail, and the Santa Fe Trail. They were not the pobrecita or the poor New Mexicans who went off to school. They were used to having servants and clothing brought from Europe, Mexico, and the Philippines. Their Majolica dinnerware and jewelry were of the best. Jewelry made up of pearls, rubies, and other fine stones. These uber-rich females were sought after wives. Dowries and inheritance would come into play by men who would later seek their hands in marriage. Again, Mercedes on the right attended Georgetown Academy. And again, these gals, left New Mexico on their own and ventured east to sort of an unknown territory. A couple of sisters, Amelia Otero, later Enriquez, they were both born to Manuel Antonio Otero and Maria Dolores Chavez. Their father was a wealthy dry goods merchant who traveled the Santa Fe Trail. Amelia attended the convent school run by the Visitation Sisters in Georgetown. Upon returning to New Mexico, she first married Benito Baca in 1874, and then she married Dr. Eduardo Enriquez in 1880, who came to New Mexico from Connecticut. At the end of her life, she traveled to California to seek a better climate, but died in 1902 at the age of 49. Her remains were transported back to New Mexico for burial. Amelia's on the left. Her sister, Beatriz Otero, again, went to school in Georgetown. When she came back, she married Carlos Armijo in June 1877 in Denver. They moved to the Las Cruces area and remained there for the rest of their lives. She, like her sister, died in 1902 and is buried in the family cemetery at St. Joseph's in the Las Cruces area. A lot of people might recognize her because their child, Nestor Armijo, again, was another Santa Fe Trail person. In July 1870, the census was taken at school, and Amelia Ortero and Marcela Chavez were enumerated next to each other. The boxes that were checked is that they had attended within the year or so had arrived there. Both girls could read and write. The front page of the DC News on the same date the census was done, headlines that war was in Europe. There's opera house information, telegrams. And so just kind of a ideology that these gals went to school, they learned English, could they read the newspaper? We don't know, but I would assume that because they were learning English, that this was part of the academia that they would have been part of. Another family, Jesus Maria and Manuela Baca's family, had a daughter, Lucia, and she went to Visitation Academy in the late 1870s. Again, their family, grandparents had sent their daughters to school in Missouri, and this was a tradition that was continued. The Perea family educated most of their children in Missouri, all traveling on the Santa Fe Trail back and forth until they were all educated. Upon her return, she married Edwin Sowers in December 1893. Her husband's career kept them out of the country, mostly in Mexico. One daughter, Maria Rose, became a sister at Visitation Convent in St. Louis, and the couple both died in Mexico. Lucia passed in November 1937. Here's a little clip from the Albuquerque newspaper of her death. Again, these people, were fairly well educated, well traveled. They did a lot of things in their lives besides marry well, or men that wanted to marry them. Mrs. Sowers, as she's called here, died in Mexico City, where she's buried. And again, this family was just very well thought of in the Albuquerque area. Later on, their son Lawrence Sowers was appointed consul general to Mexico in 1940. So again, just kind of taking a look at some of these Santa Fe Trail girls. In order to make it back east to school, the schools had rules, and they had lists of things that the girls were able or should have been willing to bring with them. A lot of this stuff is guidance for those that are attending. Things like furniture, clothing, dinnerware, and so on was required. Each student was required again to have stamps and envelopes. All mail was reviewed before a student received it. They had to have clothing for a week period consisting of 6 changes of clothing, some for summer and some for winter, straw hats and bonnets. Again, the trip from Albuquerque to Georgetown may have taken 2 months, 3 months, first to St. Louis and then overland to the East Coast. And again, because of all of the clothing and materials that these girls had to take, I don't know if they purchased some of this when they actually arrived at Georgetown, or they packed enough stuff in their hometown of Albuquerque to traverse all of this stuff on the Santa Fe Trail. So there's some missing parts of the research here in terms of stagecoaches and how much each one of the gals would have taken. Going back to Mercedes Chavez, she married Juan Batiste Lamy, named after his uncle, the bishop. They lived in Santa Fe on San Francisco Street. Her dowry was enormous, and the couple used it for traveling, house parties. And upon her death, she left monies to the beautification of Rosario Cemetery, the poor of Santa Fe, and Laredo Academy, and even more. The bulk of her estate went to her adopted daughter. She is buried at the Lamy Mausoleum in Santa Fe. So again, they went to this Catholic school, and when they died, or she died, she still left monies to the school in many various ways. Again, I think just showing some of their faith and how they felt about maybe being educated in those places. The Sisters of Laredo are another group of people that would have traveled the Santa Fe Trail. They were requested to come to New Mexico by the bishop in 1852. Again, while these sisters were there, they opened up the Catholic school for girls. They traveled with 4 other sisters, and these women would forever change New Mexico. Sister Lamy, who came with her uncle, the bishop, at a very young age, initially was a student at Laredo. She eventually became the head mistress of the convent in around 1877. The Sisters of Laredo taught English, Spanish, and French. As reported in the Santa Fe New Mexican, she was the enviable record of a life spent doing good for others with little thought for herself. And many people can look at the census and other data for the sisters, showing which of their ancestors may have attended the school in Santa Fe. Again, a very active participation, not only in the Catholic faith, but in the education early on into Santa Fe. Other students might have attended school in St. Louis. 2 sisters, Barbara Ascension and Maria Cesaria Perea, both born to Jose Leandro Perea and Dolores Chavez. Their father was known as the Sheep King of New Mexico, and their mother was the daughter of Governor Chavez, one of New Mexico's leading pioneer families. Barbara would marry Jacobo Irizarry in September 1886. And of course, her husband dealt in sheep and stock raising. Like all of the family, they all traveled the Santa Fe Trail. I mean, they also traveled it parts with train. They did other traveling. Barbara lived a long life. She was born in 1866 and died in 1951. Her sister Cesaria attended Sacred Heart also, and she married Sidney Hubble in 1885. They were divorced before 1900. The Hubble family were just another part of the whole Santa Fe Trail merchant family groups. By 1910, she had moved to California, where she remarried a second time in 1924, and she passed in California in the year of March 1926. The 1870 census for Sacred Heart in St. Louis has these 4 New Mexico girls as pupils. They all related, probably a good idea that they would all go off to school together. Maybe this happened because they wouldn't get homesick. They could help each other. I don't know. I mean, just all those things about going to boarding school. Here we have Margarita Otero at 12, Cesaria Perea, she's 18, Barbara at 14, and Lucia at 11. So a young age for a girl from New Mexico to be at a boarding school in St. Louis. And again, I think going in family groups actually helped. So let's talk a little bit more about Barbara Perea. She is buried in Albuquerque. Her headstone does not include her maiden name. It just says the Irizarry name on there. The newspaper clipping is interesting because it says she's a resident of Albuquerque for 66 years. She died Thursday in her home and lived on Silver Avenue. Again, these girls were wealthy upon themselves, and then they married into other wealthy families. She's really an interesting person because in 1924, along with her daughter Eloisa, they did a grand tour of Europe. But when Barbara married, there's a 2-page column description of the wedding in the paper. These educated women came home and they married well. Her schoolmate, Lucia Perea, was an attendant. The gifts were outlined in the newspaper, consisting of many pieces of silver, bowls, and fancy household items. Many of these women lived well into the 20th century. Again, they would have traveled the Santa Fe Trail by stagecoach, perhaps by train. Later on, they would take ships. And even some of them were part of the early automobile rage. In Barbara's case, she would have even seen airplanes So again, just in their own lifetime, the paradigm shift from one mode of transportation to the next. Barbara also traveled to Europe when she did her grand tour with her daughter. Again, an heiress, granddaughter of a governor. I would say, why not travel to Europe? I believe that, travel is another way of just extending that education. This was 1924 when they took this trip. They went to England, Belgium, Switzerland, Italy. Part of her curriculum when she was in school would have been learning English, German, and French. She already knew Spanish. And so it just, again, did the education offer the opportunity for them to travel more? Or was it the wealth that the families had that just made it more opportune for them to actually do something like that? I just don't know. Cesadia, her sister, again, the top part of the newspaper clipping is from the Albuquerque newspaper, and it shows when the kids are coming home from school. In this case, it says, Lorenzo Hubble, of St. John's, A.T. Miss Anita Harmijo, daughter of Mrs. Ambrosia Harmijo, so on and so forth. But Cesaria's daughter, Alicia Hubble, had come home. And so it says here, returned from Eastern schools, the young man from Notre Dame. And so again, it was enough significant information for them to actually make the newspaper. Unfortunately, Cesaria's daughter Alicia died while attending the convent of the Sacred Heart in St. Louis in 1903. The newspaper reported that she had had typhoid fever. Alicia had attended school since she was 10 years old, and she was on her 7th year. She was a musically talented person, beloved by her classmates. Her mother, Cesaria, attended her for 3 weeks prior to her death, and she was the only daughter of the couple, and her brother, Sidney, was not notified in time and did not attend the funeral. In Alicia's case, not everybody came home. And so it's a sad ending to a young girl's life. Other people that would have been on the trail or parts of the trail, not necessarily as students, some as students, are some Santa Fe women. Gertrudis Barcelo, or known as Doña Tules, would have been parts on the trail. She financed caravans. She lended money to people, just a very important part of the Santa Fe landscape during that time. Another woman would be Carmen Benavides, wife of Antoine Robideau. Again, they lived across the street from the cathedral. Very much a part of the legacy of her family on the Camino Real, merchant families, Rosa Bustamante, just right there in Santa Fe at the right time. Francisca Lopez Kimball and Refugio Newman Bowler would later attend school in St. Louis. I know Dr. Fran Levine has worked extensively on Francisca. Refugio's father was a Frenchman from Louisiana, her mother from the old Escobar family in Santa Fe. When she married Thomas Bowler, they traveled to Missouri and later moved to California, where she died in 1901 in San Diego. She outlived her husband by 3 decades. Again, these women, were willing to travel, get out of New Mexico, go to school, follow their husbands, whatever type of business they were in. In the Rio Bajo, or south of Santa Fe, we have a lot of women between the Otero, Perea, Armijo, Hubble, and a few other families. Many of the girls attended school in St. Louis, again, all part of the Santa Fe Trail traveling bunch. They would all return to New Mexico. Most of the women married very well. Most of them, again, were married to military men, doctors, sheep ranchers. Some were merchants already doing business on the Santa Fe Trail. I think part of this is even the women had that merchant blood in their system. It just kind of happened. And so, it wasn't surprising for my research to actually see how successful some of these women were in terms of household, what they could do for their husbands, and the family groups that they were part of. Again, Teresa de Jesus Armijo Symington traveled to France in 1921. She had lost her first husband, John, and then she secondly married John Pratt. But upon her death in Santa Fe, she was taken to Maryland to be buried beside her first husband. Again, just things that maybe would not be heard of. But these women were strong women. I think they were, because of their education, and again, because of their backgrounds, sort of had a mind of their own. In the Las Vegas area, this is a photo of Fanny Jones. You know, Las Vegas is the Santa Fe Trail. There's many of these families that I've talked about that have familiar relations there. So they not only had family in Belen or Socorro or Albuquerque, but also in Las Vegas. I often wonder if this is where they, you know, boarded the stagecoach to head east with all their clothing and trunks of clothing and other things that they would have taken with them. Victoriana Baca Sena's father was a merchant and frequent trail traveler. She had attended school from 1869 to 1873. Family that I like to research are the Panderay sisters and their mother, who all traveled the trail. Again, they settled at Rociada. Marguerite had stories where she remembered the train arriving in Las Vegas in 1880. Both these girls went to Laredo Academy in Santa Fe. Emile married Charles Rudolph in 1883, who was also a trail traveler. And then Marguerite married Jose Antonio Baca. She's a little more famous. She would later become elected as Secretary of State, where she served 2 terms. In the newspapers, she was a member of the Women's Museum Board, the Santa Fe Garden Club, founder of the Baca Needlework Guild, a member of the Santa Fe Opera Guild, and a Red Cross worker during World War II. She died in 1971. She was at least 95 years old. But again, pockets of these families throughout New Mexico. I didn't put the Las Cruces bunch in here, but there are some from the Socorro Belen area that all went to school. This photo is between Cimarron and Rayaldo, New Mexico. All these women would have passed this route on stagecoach on their way going to St. Louis or back home to wherever they were coming from. And I often wonder, would they see this as a familiar sight, the Sangre de Cristos and the open plains that, you know, signify we've arrived home. Despite the hazards of traveling halfway or all the way across the country, families and their daughters knew that being educated was an everyday relevant issue. The US was coming one way or another, or it had already come. Daughters would speak English. Having been educated, they could be hostesses, wives, and some became entrepreneurs. They in turn would be trailblazers for their daughters, and into the next century, women would continue to be educated outside of New Mexico. I really doubt that the Pereas or Otero families ever regretted their daughter's education. For the most part, these families and their fathers saw the need and were open to this women's movement in the post 1850 era. If one daughter went, so did the rest, and then their cousins would go. The socioeconomic impact of the Santa Fe Trail in terms of household, clothes, education were all relevant to these women. And I just have to say hurrah for the Hispanic households who had the foresight to educate their daughters. Thank you.